I am 64 years old, and I have learned something about grief that no one ever tells you. It does not arrive all at once. It does not knock on your door and announce itself. It slips in quietly, unnoticed at first, like a crack forming in glass. And before you realize it, that crack spreads until everything shatters. People think the worst day of my life was the day my husband died. They are wrong. The worst day of my life came later. The day I realized I had already lost everything long before death ever came to claim him. But I did not know that then. When I got married, I was young, too young to understand the difference between love and dependence. He was older, composed, steady in a way that made me feel safe. He spoke with certainty, moved with purpose, and carried himself like a man who knew exactly where he was going in life. I believed that if I followed him, I would never get lost. I had grown up in a home where survival mattered more than dreams, where silence was easier than conflict, and love was something you proved by enduring, not by receiving. So when he came into my life, offering stability, offering a future that looked secure and predictable, I held on tightly. I thought I was being saved. I did not realize I was slowly disappearing. The early years of our marriage were calm, not filled with passion, not overflowing with joy, but steady. And for someone like me, steady felt like happiness. He worked long hours building his career, and I stayed home, learning how to become the kind of wife I thought he needed. I paid attention to every small detail. How he liked his tea. How he preferred silence when he returned home. How he disliked unnecessary questions. So I stopped asking. At the time, it did not feel like losing myself. It felt like love. When our child was born, everything inside me shifted in a way I cannot fully explain. I remember holding that tiny body in my arms, feeling a kind of love so overwhelming that it frightened me. It was not gentle or calm. It was fierce, consuming, absolute. In that moment, I made a promise. I will give you everything. Everything I never had. Everything I ever wanted. Everything. That promise became my entire life. Days turned into years, and my world became smaller and smaller, but I did not notice. Because inside that small world was my child, and that was enough for me. I was always there. Always watching. Always caring. Always giving. I knew every habit, every fear, every small joy. I stayed awake through fevers, helped through struggles, celebrated every achievement as if it were my own. Because in many ways it was. My husband provided for us. He made sure we never lacked anything material. But his presence was distant. He existed in our lives the way furniture exists in a room, necessary, constant, but not something you truly connect with. He spoke little, felt even less, at least on the surface. And I accepted that. Because I had learned long ago that asking for more does not always mean receiving more. Sometimes it only reminds you of what is missing. So I poured everything into my child. Everything. I did not see that I was building something fragile. A bond so deep that it left no room for distance. No room for independence. No room for separation. I thought I was giving love. I did not realize I was creating dependence. As the years passed, my child grew into someone intelligent, capable, full of ambition. I watched with pride, with quiet satisfaction, believing that every sacrifice I had made had been worth it. When the time came to leave home for higher studies, I told myself I was prepared. This is natural, I said. This is what life is. Children grow. They leave. They build their own worlds. And mothers learn to step back. I smiled when I said goodbye. I encouraged every step forward. I said all the right things. But the moment the door closed behind that departure, something inside me collapsed. The house became too quiet. Too empty. I found myself walking into rooms for no reason, touching objects that no longer had purpose, holding on to the echoes of a life that had already moved on. At first, they were calls. Frequent, warm, reassuring. Then they became shorter. Less frequent. More distant. I told myself it was normal. I told myself not to be selfish. I told myself not to interfere. And slowly, I became someone who waited. Waited for calls. Waited for visits. Waited for attention that used to come freely. My husband did not seem to notice the change. Or perhaps he simply did not acknowledge it. Focus on your own life, he once said. As if I had one outside of what I had built around others. So I remained silent. I adapted. I shrank my expectations. Because I believed that love meant understanding, even when it hurt. Years passed like that. Quietly. Gradually. Until one day, everything changed. My husband collapsed without warning. No preparation. No final words. No time to process what was happening. Just one moment he was there. And the next he was gone. People gathered. They spoke of his success, his discipline, his achievements. They praised the life he had built. They called him a great man. And I stood there, listening, nodding, thanking them. Playing the role I was expected to play. But inside, there was a strange emptiness. Not overwhelming grief. Not immediate heartbreak. Just silence. A hollow space where something should have been. And that frightened me more than anything. Because it made me question everything. Had I loved him? Or had I simply lived beside him? Had we built a life together? Or had we just existed in the same space? After the funeral, the house became unbearable. Every corner held memories, but none of them felt warm enough to comfort me. My child stayed for a few days. Handled everything. Organized everything. Spoke to people. Took control in a way that felt unfamiliar. There was a distance there now. A formality. A calm detachment that I could not recognize. "Are you okay?" I was asked. And for the first time, I did not know how to answer. "I don't know," I said. And that was the truth. A simple nod followed. "You'll be fine." Fine. Such a small word. Such a heavy expectation. After a few days, the house was empty again. And this time, it felt different. Not just quiet. Not just lonely. But final. Like something had ended, completely. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. I learned how to exist in silence. How to move through life without expecting anything. How to accept that perhaps this was what remained. This was what life looked like now. But I was wrong. Because what I thought was the end was only the beginning. The beginning of a loss far greater than death itself. Because death takes people away. But betrayal makes you realize they were already gone. And soon, I was going to lose the only person I still believed was mine. The silence after loss is not peaceful. People imagine it that way, as if quietness brings rest, as if the absence of noise somehow softens the absence of people. But silence, real silence, is heavy. It presses against your chest, settles into your bones, and reminds you with every passing moment that someone is missing. After the funeral, after the last visitor left and the final condolences were spoken, I found myself alone in a house that no longer felt like a home. Every object remained in its place, untouched, unchanged, as if time itself had refused to move forward. His chair was still by the window, his shoes still near the door, his cup still resting where he had last left it. But none of it felt alive anymore. It all felt like a museum of a life that had quietly ended. I tried to continue as if nothing had changed. I woke up at the same time every morning, prepared meals for 2 out of habit, and then forced myself to eat alone. I would sit at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from me, sometimes forgetting for a few seconds that no one would come to fill it. Those few seconds were the hardest. That brief illusion of normalcy before reality returned like a cold hand around my throat. My child called me occasionally in the beginning. The voice on the other end was calm, composed, efficient. There were questions, practical ones. Had I handled the paperwork? Was everything settled? Did I need financial help? I answered everything properly, like someone giving a report rather than speaking to family. I noticed it even then, that distance in the tone, that careful way of speaking as if emotions had to be measured and controlled. "I'm fine," I would say, even when I was. "You're strong," I would hear in return. And that word again, strong. As if strength meant silence. As if strength meant enduring everything without asking for comfort. The calls became less frequent with time. Not suddenly, not in a way that could be questioned. Just gradually. 1 week turned into 2, 2 into 3. Then a month passed without a single call, and I found myself staring at my phone more often than I cared to admit. Waiting, hopping, listening for a sound that never came. I told myself not to be needy. I told myself not to become a burden. I reminded myself that life was busy, that responsibilities were growing, that I had no right to demand attention. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the truth remained simple and painful. I miss my child. Not just the presence, but the connection. The effortless closeness that had once defined my entire existence. The way conversations used to flow without effort, the way laughter used to fill spaces that now echoed with emptiness. One evening, after weeks of silence, I decided to call. My hand trembled slightly as I held the phone. I don't know why. Perhaps because deep down I was afraid of what I might hear, or worse, what I might not hear. The call was answered after several rings. The voice on the other end was distracted. "Yes." For a moment, I didn't speak. That single word felt unfamiliar, distant, not the warmth I had once known, not the comfort I had built my life around. "It's me," I said softly. A pause. Then, "Oh, I've been busy." "Busy? Always busy." "I just wanted to hear your voice," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, careful not to sound like I was asking for too much. "I'm in the middle of something right now. Can I call you later?" "Later?" That word carried more weight than it should have. "Yes, of course," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The call ended. I sat there for a long time afterward, the phone still in my hand, staring at the blank screen as if it might suddenly come back to life, as if the conversation might continue if I waited long enough. But it didn't. And later never came. That night, I did not cry. Not because I didn't feel pain, but because the pain had changed. It was no longer sharp or overwhelming. It was quiet, settled, like something that had made itself comfortable inside me. Days passed and I stopped calling. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because I began to understand something I had refused to accept before. You cannot force someone to remember you. You cannot demand a place in someone's life if they have already decided to move on without you. So I waited in silence. And in that silence, memories began to surface, uninvited, persistent, impossible to ignore. I remembered the years I had spent building my entire world around one person. The sacrifices that had once felt natural, the choices that had seemed obvious at the time. I remembered how I had slowly let go of everything that belonged to me. My interests, my friendships, my sense of identity. All of it had been replaced by roles: wife, mother, caretaker. Roles I had embraced fully without question. And now, those roles were gone. What remained was a woman who did not know who she was outside of them. That realization was more frightening than loneliness. Because loneliness can be filled. But emptiness is something you have to rebuild from nothing. One afternoon, I decided to leave the house. It sounds simple, but it was. For weeks, I had limited my world to those walls, as if stepping outside would somehow confirm that life had moved on without me. The air felt different when I stepped out. Colder, sharper, more real than anything I had felt in weeks. I walked without direction at first, letting my feet carry me wherever they wanted to go. People passed by, living their lives, talking, laughing, moving with purpose. None of them knew me. None of them knew what I had lost. And for the first time, I realized something. The world does not stop for grief. It continues. Unchanged. Unaffected. Indifferent. That realization hurt, but it also awakened something inside me. A small, quiet awareness that perhaps I had been standing still, while everything else moved forward. Days turned into weeks, and I began to create small routines outside the house. Short walks, brief visits to nearby shops, simple interactions with strangers that required nothing from me and gave nothing in return. It was easier that way. Safer. Because expectations lead to disappointment. And I had already learned that lesson too well. Then, one day, the phone rang. I wasn't expecting it. I had stopped expecting anything. But when I saw who it was, something inside me shifted, hope, fragile and hesitant, rising despite everything. I answered immediately. The voice on the other end sounded different. Not warm. Not distant either. Just formal. "I need to talk to you," I was told. There was something in the tone that made my chest tighten. "Is everything okay?" I asked. A pause. "Then, I'll explain when I see you." See me? It had been months. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow." Just one word. Firm. Decided. Not a question. Not a request. A statement. And for reasons I couldn't fully understand, I felt afraid. That night, I barely slept. Not because I knew what was coming, but because deep down, I felt that whatever it was going to change everything. The next morning arrived heavier than any morning I could remember. It was not just the weight of uncertainty, but the feeling that something irreversible was about to happen, something that would divide my life into a before and an after. I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sunlight reached the windows. For a few moments, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. It sounded louder than it ever had before, as if time itself was reminding me that it would not slow down for whatever awaited me that day. I got up slowly, moving through my routine with mechanical precision. I chose my clothes carefully, not because it mattered to anyone else, but because it felt like the only thing I could still control. I prepared tea, but I could not drink it. My hands trembled slightly as I held the cup, so I placed it back on the table untouched. When the time came, I sat on the sofa, waiting. The minutes stretched endlessly, each one pressing against my chest like a silent question. And then, finally, there was a knock on the door. It was not loud, not urgent, just a simple, controlled knock. But it echoed through the house like a signal that something inside me was about to break. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling heavier with each step toward the door. When I opened it, I saw a face that was both familiar and distant at the same time. For a brief second, I searched for the warmth I used to know, for the softness that once defined that expression. But it wasn't there. What stood before me was someone composed, serious, almost guarded. "Can I come in?" the voice asked. I stepped aside without saying a word. The air inside the house felt colder as the door closed behind us. We moved to the living room, the same room where so many memories had once been created, though now it felt like a place belonging to another life. There was no small talk, no gentle easing into conversation, just silence, thick and uncomfortable, stretching between us. Finally, the words came. "I've been thinking a lot about things." I nodded slowly, waiting. "About the future, about what needs to change." Something inside me tightened. The word change did not sound hopeful. It sounded final. "I think it's better if you move." For a moment, I didn't understand. The words hung in the air, unfamiliar, disconnected from reality. "Move." I repeated quietly. "Yes," came the reply, calm, almost rehearsed. "This house is too big for you. It doesn't make sense for you to stay here alone." I felt the ground shift beneath me, not physically but emotionally, as if something stable had suddenly become uncertain. "This is my home," I said softly, more to myself than to anyone else. "It was our home." A brief pause followed. "It was," the voice corrected gently. "But things are different now." Different, that word again. Always so simple, yet so capable of carrying so much loss within it. "I've already spoken to someone," the voice continued. We can sell the house quickly. You'll get a smaller place, something more manageable. It's better for you. Better for me. I repeated those words silently in my mind, trying to understand them, trying to find the care within them that I wanted to believe was there. But all I could feel was distance. Did you ask me? I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a slight shift, a subtle discomfort. I'm thinking about what's practical, came the response. You shouldn't have to deal with all this alone. I looked around the room, the walls, the furniture, the small details that carried decades of life. Every corner held something of me, something I had built, something I had lived through, and suddenly it felt like none of it belonged to me anymore. I'm not asking for help, I said quietly. I'm asking to stay in my home. Another pause, longer this time. You're not seeing the bigger picture, the voice replied, firmer now. This isn't about emotions, it's about what makes sense. Not about emotions. The words landed heavily, cutting deeper than they should have, because everything in my life had always been about emotions, about love, about sacrifice, about giving without expecting anything in return. And now I was being told that none of that mattered. I don't want to leave, I said, and this time my voice carried more weight, more truth than anything I had said before. There was a sigh, not of anger, not of frustration, but of impatience. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder. As if losing my home, my memories, my place in the world was something simple that I was complicating unnecessarily. I'm trying to help you, the voice continued. You can't live like this forever. Live like this. Alone, quiet, invisible. The words were not cruel, but they felt that way because they carried no understanding of what I was feeling. I have been living like this, I replied softly, and no one asked me how that felt. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was different. It was no longer just heavy. It was final. I've already started the process, came the next sentence, and this time it did not sound like a discussion. It sounded like a decision that had already been made. Something inside me broke at that moment, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly like a thread snapping under pressure, because I realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. This was not about helping me. This was about control, about convenience, about removing something that no longer fit into a new life that did not include me the way it once had. You made this decision without me, I said, my voice steady now, calmer than I felt. Because I knew you would resist, came the reply, and there it was, the truth, simple and unhidden. I stood there for a long moment looking at the person I had once built my entire world around, and for the first time I saw clearly, not who they had been, but who they had become, or perhaps who they had always been and I had simply chosen not to see. When do I have to leave? I asked. The question surprised even me. It came out without hesitation, without emotion, as if I had already accepted something I had just begun to understand. There was a slight pause, as if that response had not been expected. We can arrange something within a few weeks, came the answer, a few weeks. That was all it took to erase decades of life. I nodded slowly. All right, I said, and just like that it was done. No argument, no pleading, no tears, because in that moment I understood something that changed everything. You cannot hold onto a place in someone's life if they have already decided to remove you from it. And as I stood there, in the home that no longer felt like mine, I realized that I was not just being asked to leave a house. I was being asked to leave behind a life that had already ended without me noticing. And this time, I would have to decide whether I would walk away quietly or finally begin to see my own worth. The days that followed did not feel real. Everything moved forward as if guided by an invisible force, something beyond my control, something that did not pause to ask whether I was ready. Papers appeared, documents were placed in front of me, voices spoke about numbers, timelines, arrangements. I listened, nodded, signed where I was told to sign. It felt as if I had stepped outside of my own life and was watching another woman go through the motions of losing everything she had once called hers. The house began to change even before I left it. It was subtle at first. A man came to evaluate the property. He walked through each room with a clipboard, barely glancing at the things that held meaning to me. He measured walls, inspected corners, spoke about value and potential, as if this place were nothing more than a structure made of wood and stone. I followed him quietly, my hands clasped together, resisting the urge to tell him that this was not just a house, that this was where I had lived, where I had loved, where I had built a life piece by piece. But I said nothing, because I had begun to understand that my words no longer carried weight in decisions that affected me the most. Soon after, strangers started coming to view the house. They walked through the rooms with curiosity, whispering among themselves, imagining how they would change things, what they would remove, what they would redesign. One woman stood in the living room and said, "We could knock down this wall and open up the space." I stood there, frozen, staring at the wall she was casually planning to destroy. That wall had once held photographs, memories, moments that had defined entire chapters of my life. And now, to her, it was just an obstacle in the way of something more modern, more convenient. I realized then how easily a life can be erased when it is no longer protected by the people who once helped build it. I began packing my belongings slowly, carefully, as if each item required permission to be moved. I opened drawers that had not been touched in years, finding small pieces of the past hidden in forgotten corners. Old letters, photographs, objects that once had purpose but had been left behind as time moved forward. I sat on the floor one afternoon, surrounded by these fragments, holding a photograph in my hands. It was from years ago, a moment captured in time when everything still felt whole. I looked at the faces in that picture, at the smiles that once felt real, and I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for far too long. When did it start to change? When did we begin to drift so far apart that I became someone who could be removed from a home without being asked? I could not find the answer, because change does not always announce itself. It happens quietly, slowly, in small moments that seem insignificant at the time. A missed conversation, a silence left unaddressed, a feeling ignored. And before you realize it, everything is different. One evening, while packing a box of kitchen items, I found something that made my hands stop moving. It was a small cup, nothing special to anyone else, but to me, it carried a memory so vivid it felt like stepping back in time. It had been used years ago, during mornings that no longer existed. Back when laughter was easy, when conversations filled the air, when the idea of losing everything felt impossible. I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling the weight of it, not because it was heavy, but because of everything it represented. And for the first time since all of this had begun, I cried, not loudly, not uncontrollably, just quietly, as if the tears had been waiting for permission to exist, because it was no longer just about the house. It was about everything that had been lost along the way, the version of myself who had lived here, the life I had built around others, the belief that love, once given fully, would always be returned. A few days later, I was shown the apartment I would be moving into. It was smaller, much smaller, clean, simple, practical. Everything about it felt temporary, even though I knew it was meant to be permanent. The walls were bare, the rooms empty, the air unfamiliar. I walked through it slowly, trying to imagine myself living there, trying to see how my life would fit into a space that felt so disconnected from everything I had known. "It's perfect for you," I was told. Perfect. That word felt strange, because perfection, I realized, is often defined by convenience, not by comfort. I nodded, because I had learned that agreeing was easier than resisting. The day I left the house arrived without ceremony. There was no moment of reflection offered, no space to say goodbye properly. Boxes were loaded, keys were handed over, and just like that, it was done. I stood outside for a moment, looking at the place that had once held my entire life. The windows reflected the sky, empty and indifferent, as if they no longer recognized me. I waited just for a second, hoping I might feel something strong enough to stop me from walking away. But all I felt was a quiet acceptance, because deep down I knew the truth. I had not lost this house in a single moment. I had been losing it for years, slowly, silently, without realizing it. The move itself was quick, efficient, controlled, just like everything else. When I stepped into the new apartment for the first time, it felt unfamiliar in a way that made my chest tighten. The silence here was different, not filled with memories, not heavy with the past, just empty, purely empty. I placed my belongings down, one box at a time, unsure of where anything truly belonged. Because for the first time in my life, I did not know where I belonged either. That night, I sat by the window, looking out at a view that meant nothing to me. The city moved on as it always did, lights flickering, people passing by, life continuing without pause. And I sat there in that unfamiliar space, realizing something that changed everything. I had spent my entire life building something for others, a home, a family, a sense of stability that I believed would always include me. But now, standing at the edge of what remained, I saw the truth clearly. I had never built anything for myself, and now I had nothing left to stand on. But somewhere deep beneath the sadness, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the quiet acceptance of everything I had lost, Something else began to form. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. A small, almost unnoticeable shift. The beginning of a question I had never asked before. If everything I built for others can be taken away, then what would happen if I finally started building something for myself? That night, I did not find the answer. But for the first time in a very long time, I realized I needed to. The days after that quiet realization did not suddenly become brighter, but they became clearer. There is a difference between the two. Brightness suggests joy, something immediate and visible, while clarity is quieter, slower, like a fog lifting just enough for you to see where you are standing. I began to notice how much of my life had been lived on autopilot, how I had moved from one responsibility to another without ever stopping to ask myself what I wanted. It was not a dramatic discovery. It did not come with tears or sudden strength. It came in small, almost uncomfortable moments of awareness. Like when I sat with my tea in the morning and realized there was no one to hurry for, no one to serve, no one to adjust myself for. The freedom felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling because I did not know how to use it. For so long, my value had been measured by how much I gave, how much I sacrificed, how much I endured. Without those things, I felt undefined. One morning, instead of immediately filling the silence with cleaning or pointless tasks, I remained seated. I let the quiet exist around me without trying to fix it. It was not easy. My mind kept searching for something to do, something to hold on to, but I resisted the urge. I simply sat there, breathing, allowing myself to feel whatever came. At first, it was discomfort, then sadness, then something deeper, something harder to name. It felt like grief, but not just for the people I had lost. It was grief for the years I had given away without ever questioning whether I was losing myself in the process. That realization stayed with me throughout the day. It followed me as I walked outside again, as I passed the same streets, the same faces, the same ordinary scenes that had begun to feel slightly less distant. I noticed that I was no longer just observing the world. I was beginning to feel a small connection to it again, even if it was fragile. I returned to that small shop without planning to. My steps slowed as I approached it, as if my body recognized something my mind had not fully accepted yet. This time, when I stepped inside, I did not feel like a stranger. I took my time, looking at the items more carefully. Simple things, everyday things, yet there was something grounding about them. They existed without expectation. They did not demand anything from me, and for once I did not feel like I had to give anything in return. I picked up a small object without thinking much about it. It was nothing valuable, nothing necessary, but I held it in my hand longer than I should have. For years, I had made decisions based on practicality, on necessity, on what made sense for others. This was different. This was unnecessary. And somehow that made it important. I bought it. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to. That small act stayed with me long after I left the shop. It may have seemed insignificant, but to me, it felt like a quiet shift. A moment where I chose something for myself without guilt, without justification. When I returned to the apartment, I placed that object on the table near the window. It did not change the space, but it changed how I felt within it. It was a reminder that this place could hold things that belonged to me, not just leftovers from a life that had ended. That evening, I opened the notebook again. Writing had become something I looked forward to, though I did not fully understand why. Perhaps because it was the only place where I could speak freely without fear of being dismissed or ignored. I wrote about the shop, about the small purchase, about how strange it felt to make a decision that did not revolve around someone else's needs. As I wrote, I began to see patterns in my own life that I had never noticed before. How I had always adjusted, always adapted, always placed myself second without ever questioning it. Not because anyone explicitly forced me to, but because I believed that was what love required. That night, I did not feel as empty as I had before. The silence was still there, but it felt different, less suffocating, more like space than absence. The next few days followed a similar rhythm. I created small routines, not out of obligation but out of intention. Morning tea by the window, a walk outside, time spent writing, occasional visits to places that felt neutral, places that did not carry the weight of my past. Slowly, the apartment began to feel less foreign, not because it had changed, but because I had started to exist within it differently. I moved things around, added small touches, arranged my space in a way that felt comfortable rather than simply functional. For the first time, I was not creating a home for others. I was creating it for myself. One afternoon, while sitting by the window, I realized something that both surprised and unsettled me. I had not thought about calling, not once, not out of anger or pride, but because the need to reach out had begun to fade. That realization was complicated. It was not relief. It was not bitterness. It was something in between. A quiet understanding that perhaps the distance I had once feared was not something I needed to fight anymore. I had spent so much time waiting, hopping, holding on to the idea that things would return to what they once were. But now, I was beginning to see that there was nothing to return to. The past was not a place I could go back to. It was something I had to let go of. That evening, I wrote about it. About the absence of that need, about how strange it felt to not be waiting for a call that used to define my days. I expected to feel sadness as I wrote those words, but what I felt instead was something quieter. Acceptance. Not complete, not perfect, but present. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, I felt a little less like someone who had been left behind and a little more like someone who was moving forward, even if slowly. I began to understand that rebuilding a life does not happen all at once. It happens in moments, in small choices, in quiet decisions that seem insignificant but slowly reshape everything. And yet, even as this new sense of awareness began to grow, I knew something was still unresolved. There were things left unsaid, questions left unanswered, feelings that had been pushed aside but not fully released. I could feel them beneath the surface, waiting, not to break me, but to be faced. Because no matter how far I moved forward, I could not truly rebuild my life without confronting what had been lost, and why. And deep down, I knew that moment was coming, not because I wanted it to, but because some truths refused to stay buried forever. The feeling that something unresolved remained did not come all at once. It lingered quietly beneath everything I was beginning to rebuild, like a shadow that followed me even in moments of calm. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that moving forward was enough, that I did not need to reopen what had already caused me so much pain. But the truth has a way of surfacing when you finally become still enough to hear it. One evening, as I sat by the window with my notebook open, I found myself unable to write. The pen remained still in my hand, hovering above the page, while my thoughts circled around something I had been avoiding for weeks. It was not just the loss of my home, or the silence that had replaced the life I once knew. It was the way it had all happened, the decisions made without me, the distance that had grown without explanation, the quiet way I had been removed from a life I had once been central to. I realized then that I had accepted everything too easily, not because it did not hurt, but because I had spent my entire life believing that enduring was the same as being strong, that staying quiet was the same as being understanding, that letting others decide for me was the same as love. But sitting there in that small apartment with nothing left to lose, I began to question that belief for the first time. Was it really strength, or was it fear? Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of losing the little connection I had left. The answer came slowly, but when it did, it was undeniable. I had been afraid to demand my place, afraid to speak when I felt ignored, afraid to risk being seen as difficult or unwanted. And in trying so hard to avoid being pushed away, I had allowed it to happen anyway. That realization did not bring immediate courage. It brought discomfort, a deep, unsettling awareness that I had participated in my own silence, that I had made it easier for others to overlook me by never insisting on being seen. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, letting that truth settle inside me. It was not easy to accept, but it was necessary. Because for the first time, I understood that moving forward was not just about building something new. It was also about understanding what had been lost and why. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination that felt unfamiliar. Not strong, not overwhelming, but steady. Like something inside me had finally aligned with a truth I could no longer ignore. I knew what I needed to do, not for confrontation, not for revenge, but for clarity. I needed to speak. Not to change the past, but to finally give voice to everything I had kept inside for so long. The thought of it made my chest tighten. Old habits do not disappear overnight. The part of me that had spent years avoiding conflict whispered that it was unnecessary, that it would only create more distance, more discomfort. But another part of me, quieter but firmer, reminded me that silence had already cost me too much. I did not call immediately. I gave myself time, walking outside, letting the air settle my thoughts. I passed the same streets, the same places that had slowly become familiar, but everything felt different now. Not because the world had changed, but because I was beginning to see it differently. I was no longer just observing life. I was preparing to step back into it. When I returned home, I sat down and picked up the phone. My hand did not tremble this time, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I understood that fear no longer had the right to control me. The call was answered after a few rings. The voice on the other end sounded the same as always, controlled, measured. Hello. For a brief moment, I hesitated, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood that this conversation would not undo what had already happened. It would not restore what had been lost, but it would give me something I had been missing, my voice. I need to talk to you, I said. There was a pause. About what? The question was simple, but the tone carried a familiar distance. It no longer surprised me. About everything, I replied calmly. Another pause, longer this time. Is something wrong? I took a slow breath. Yes, I said, there is. Silence followed, not uncomfortable this time, but expectant. I'll come tomorrow, I continued. We need to speak in person. There was no immediate response, and for the first time I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it exist. I let the weight of my words settle. All right, came the reply eventually. Tomorrow. The call ended. I placed the phone down gently and sat back, feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not relief, not anxiety, but readiness. That night I did not write in my notebook. I did not distract myself with routine or unnecessary tasks. I allowed myself to sit with everything I was about to face. The memories, the hurt, the questions that had remained unanswered for too long. It was not easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether this was the right decision, whether it would only reopen wounds that had begun to heal. But each time that doubt appeared, I reminded myself of one simple truth. Avoiding pain does not heal it. It only buries it deeper. And I was no longer willing to live buried beneath my own silence. The next morning arrived with a quiet sense of purpose. I got ready slowly, choosing my clothes with the same care as before, not out of habit, but because I wanted to show up as someone who respected herself. Not someone asking for understanding, but someone stating her truth. When I stepped outside, the air felt different again. Not lighter, not heavier, just clear. As if everything had led to this moment. As if every step I had taken since leaving that house had been preparing me for this. I walked with steady steps, not rushing, not hesitating. And as I moved forward, I realized something that gave me more strength than I expected. I was not going there to reclaim what I had lost. I was going there to understand it, to face it, and finally to release it, because only then could I truly begin again. The day felt heavier than I expected, as if the sun had decided to weigh down on every step I took. The streets seemed quieter, the air thicker, carrying with it echoes of the life I had left behind. Each step toward the place I once called home was accompanied by memories that crowded my mind relentlessly. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay present, to separate the past from what was now. When I arrived, I paused at the door, feeling the weight of anticipation settle in my chest like a stone. The familiar creak of the floor beneath my feet brought a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease. The silence inside was almost tangible, stretching out like a living entity. I waited, uncertain who would speak first, feeling the tension of all those unspoken words pressing on both sides of the room. And then, finally, words emerged. Not immediately apologetic, not defensive, just careful, measured. I listened without interrupting, letting the voice fill the space between us, recognizing the same restraint I had practiced for so long. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, knowing that what I said would not undo the past but could illuminate it. I told everything I had kept inside for years. The confusion, the hurt, the quiet desperation of feeling unseen. Not as accusations, but as truths that needed to be spoken. As the conversation continued, the tension did not disappear, but it transformed. It became a shared acknowledgement of what had happened, of the consequences of silence, of the ways we had both participated in the distance that had grown between us. I realized that clarity was not about changing what had been, but about understanding it, about giving voice to what had been left unspoken for far too long. There were moments of hesitation, moments when old fears threatened to resurface, but I held firm. I had come here not to argue, not to beg, but to face reality with courage. And in doing so, I felt a subtle shift inside me. A part of me that had been buried beneath years of quiet endurance began to rise. A part that understood that healing did not mean erasing the past, but integrating it into a stronger sense of self. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The conversation moved through regret, explanation, acknowledgement, and eventually, a kind of mutual understanding. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation in its traditional sense, but something equally powerful: recognition. Recognition that the past was unchangeable, but that it could be understood, faced, and honored. When I finally left that room, the weight on my chest had lifted slightly, though I knew the journey was far from over. Walking back through the streets, I noticed details I had never seen before: the way the light hit the buildings, the subtle rustle of leaves, the distant hum of life moving forward. It felt different now, not just because I had confronted what I needed to, but because I carried within me a new sense of agency. A sense that my voice mattered, that my story mattered, that my presence mattered. The return to my own space that evening was quiet but filled with a newfound clarity. I sat by the window once more, letting the events of the day settle around me. There was no euphoria, no dramatic revelation, just a calm acknowledgement that I had taken a crucial step. A step toward owning my experiences, my feelings, my life. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope, not a reckless, naive hope, but a steady, deliberate one. The kind that grows quietly in the heart, nurtured by truth, courage, and the recognition of one's own resilience. At night, as darkness enveloped the room, I wrote again. Not to escape, not to process pain, but to affirm my presence. To declare silently but firmly that I had faced what needed facing and that I was still here, still whole, still capable of moving forward. And as the words filled the page, I realized something profound. The story was not just about loss. It was about survival, about awakening, about the subtle, quiet strength that emerges when one chooses to confront rather than evade. And in that realization, I finally began to feel a sense of peace, fragile yet undeniable, that promised the possibility of renewal. The mornings no longer felt like a burden, though they carried with them a quiet weight. I moved through the familiar routines with a new awareness, noticing the subtle rhythms of life I had previously overlooked. Every sound, every scent, every fleeting moment held significance, reminding me that life continued in its persistent, unyielding way. I found myself drawn to small acts of care, preparing a meal slowly, savoring the taste, watching sunlight spill across the floor, feeling the texture of a book's pages beneath my fingers. These moments became anchors, gentle reminders that the world did not pause for grief, and that I too could find steadiness within it. There were times when memories would surface unbidden, sharp and intrusive, threatening to pull me back into old sorrow. But now I met them differently. I did not push them away, nor did I cling. I observed them as passing shadows, acknowledging their presence without allowing them to define the day. Conversations with others grew more intentional. I listened with a focus I had never afforded before, noticing the nuances in tone, in expression, in the small hesitations that revealed more than words alone. I discovered a quiet satisfaction in these connections, a recognition that even amid loneliness, one could find resonance with others. My evenings became spaces for reflection, not escape. I would sit in silence, sometimes with a notebook, sometimes simply with the quiet hum of life around me, and trace the contours of my thoughts. It was not always comfortable. There were nights when regret or longing rose like a tide, unbidden and relentless. Yet even then, I discovered a strange resilience within myself. I realized that grief was not a singular, conquerable thing, but a companion, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, that walked alongside me. Accepting this allowed a subtle shift. Instead of resisting, I began to inhabit life more fully, allowing both sorrow and joy to coexist. Occasionally, I would revisit old spaces, places filled with echoes of the past. Each visit was a careful negotiation between remembrance and presence, a deliberate effort to honor what had been without being consumed by it. In these moments, I felt a growing capacity for patience, for understanding, for letting go of rigid expectations about how life should unfold. There were opportunities that emerged unexpectedly, invitations to new experiences, fleeting chances to engage with the world beyond my immediate circle. I took them with cautious curiosity, stepping into the unfamiliar while carrying the lessons of my past close to my heart. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, a sense of agency began to deepen within me. I was no longer merely reacting to the currents of circumstance. I was navigating them with intention, aware that my choices, small as they might seem, had the power to shape my path. By the time the days began to stretch longer, with light lingering into the evening, I felt a subtle but undeniable change. The heaviness that had once defined my existence was no longer a constant, oppressive presence. It remained, yes, in moments of reflection and in the quiet ache of memory, but it no longer dictated the entirety of my being. I understood, finally, that living with loss did not mean living without hope. And in this understanding, I found a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet, steady determination to continue, to embrace life in all its complexity, and to honor both the past and the possibilities that lay ahead. The world continued to move, indifferent to my pain, yet I discovered that I could move with it rather than against it. Each day began with intention, a conscious choice to engage with life rather than retreat into grief. I focused on the things I could control, my own actions, my own responses, and let go of those I could not. Conversations that once felt impossible became opportunities for connection. I spoke with people I had avoided, shared stories I had kept locked away, and discovered that vulnerability could be met with empathy rather than judgment. My home, once a place of quiet despair, became a space of reflection and renewal. I arranged my surroundings thoughtfully, keeping reminders of both struggle and strength close at hand, and letting sunlight fill the corners I had long ignored. Work, previously a source of exhaustion, became a channel for focus and accomplishment. I applied myself with care and discipline, honoring my own efforts and acknowledging that my contributions mattered. Occasionally, reminders of the past pierced this calm, memories of betrayal, of exclusion, of loneliness, but I met them with a gentleness I had never known. I did not fight them. I observed them, let them pass, and returned to the present with steadier footing. Relationships shifted as well. I no longer demanded the recognition or approval I had once craved from those who had hurt me. Instead, I cultivated connections that were mutual, nourishing, and respectful. In these exchanges, I discovered that love could exist without sacrifice of self, that respect was earned through presence and action, not assumed by blood alone. Nights were still times of introspection, but they no longer carried the same oppressive weight. I wrote, I read, I listened to music that stirred something deep within me, and I let myself dream again, carefully, cautiously, but without fear. And in this renewed attention to life, I felt a quiet power return. I was no longer defined solely by the losses I had endured, nor by the betrayals I had suffered. I was defined by resilience, by the choices I made each day, by the determination to honor my own journey. Eventually, I understood that healing was not a destination but a practice, a daily commitment to presence, to awareness, to the cultivation of peace and purpose. And with that understanding, a calm certainty settled within me. I could face whatever came next, not as a victim, not as a shadow of past sacrifices, but as a fully realized individual who had weathered storms, who had loved deeply, and who had emerged stronger, clearer, and unafraid to claim the life that was rightfully hers. Time continued to pass, and with it, a sense of clarity grew stronger within me. I no longer allowed myself to be defined by the hurt or betrayal of others, though I did not pretend it had never happened. Instead, I acknowledged it fully, numbing the pain, letting it exist alongside my own determination to move forward. I invested in myself, in my health, in my mind and spirit, realizing that the life I had built for others could now also serve me. Each morning, I rose with intention, setting goals not for approval or validation, but for my own fulfillment. I explored old passions I had neglected, revisited skills I had honed over years, and discovered new interests that sparked joy I had long forgotten. I forged connections with people who saw me for who I truly was, who celebrated my resilience rather than measuring me by past sacrifices. There were moments of longing, of wishing things could have been different, yet I no longer clung to what could not be changed. I learned that boundaries were acts of self-respect, that saying no could be as powerful as saying yes, and that love for oneself was not selfish but necessary. Nights became times of reflection and gratitude rather than dread. I celebrated the small victories, the clarity of thought, the calm in my heart, the knowledge that I was no longer at the mercy of anyone else's choices. Slowly, the weight that had pressed on me for so long began to lift. My past sacrifices, once a source of silent resentment and pain, became a testament to my strength and dedication. I saw that my love, though taken for granted by some, had created life, nurtured growth, and built foundations strong enough to support a future I could now claim fully. I embraced this truth with quiet pride, understanding that my journey was mine alone, that the bonds I had formed and the struggles I had endured had shaped a woman who was not defined by betrayal, but by resilience, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of self. Each day became a conscious practice of living fully, of making decisions with intention, and of surrounding myself with people and experiences that reflected the respect and love I now demanded from life itself. In this way, I rebuilt not only my spirit but my entire world, step by deliberate step, discovering that even after deep pain, it was possible to live with dignity, purpose, and joy. I finally understood that life could no longer be lived in the shadow of past wounds. The anger, the hurt, and the betrayal had shaped me, but they would not define the rest of my story. I took control of my time, my energy, and my choices, no longer waiting for permission or recognition from those who had failed to see my worth. I invested in projects that reflected my own passions, traveled to places I had dreamed of but never dared to visit, and surrounded myself with people who valued me for my presence, not for what I could give them. Memories of the past no longer brought tears but lessons, proof of endurance, of love given freely, and of strength discovered in the quietest moments. I nurtured myself with the same care I had once reserved solely for others, and in doing so, I found a sense of peace that had been elusive for decades. I learned to celebrate my achievements without the need for approval, to enjoy the simple pleasures that had once been luxuries denied, and to set boundaries that protected my heart while honoring my capacity to love. The house I had sold, the inheritance I had spent, the years of labor, they were all parts of a journey that had led me to a place of wisdom and resilience. In time, I realized that the most important relationship in my life was the one I cultivated with myself, that self-respect and self-love were the truest forms of power, and that no one could diminish the woman I had become. I moved forward with clarity, purpose, and an unwavering sense of dignity, embracing the life I had fought to build and the future I had earned. The shadows of betrayal could not touch me anymore, for I had claimed my own light, and in that light, I found freedom, strength, and a joy that was entirely my own. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video, make sure to follow and subscribe to our channel for more heartbreaking stories and silent pain diaries. Pensive face, hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Sparkling heart, thank you.